When I was growing up, next door to me was a gentleman who, when he had moved in, we learned that his occupation was a professor. He was an Oxford-trained scholar who had received his D.Phil in Oxford in English literature. He was the dean of the regional university for arts and sciences, and so he was a prolific scholar, a very intelligent man, and he had great skills. But when his father-in-law would come around and check out the house and yard, he would say to him, "Son, if you had a rock garden, you could kill it." He might have been brilliant in the ways of scholarship, but thanks to his next-door teenage neighbor who cut his lawn, the lawn always looked better than if he had cut it. He just didn't seem to have that knack for the outdoors or for any skill around the house. He could write a paper and be prolific in his scholarship, but when it came to basic things, he was no scientist or scholar there. Sometimes the most enlightened people are the least insightful people. It's the phrase that's come to be known as the educated fool, if you would. The person who has so much knowledge that their head is so large, and yet when it comes to common sense, it's not so common for them. It lacks. For some of the most enlightened people, the educated fool, they lack common sense. They are muddled in their thinking on origins and destiny of humanity, that the reasons for life and the morality that exists are just a large pool of confusion. When it comes to John 9, we get this kind of scenario, the kind of the educated fools, if you would, who don't understand the ways of life and the ways of godliness, though they have been well-trained and well-schooled. The light of the world, Jesus, has come into the world, but the world has not received him, is what John has told us. He's told us throughout this gospel that that's the expectation of what we will find Jesus to do, is that he will come and he will shine his light and people will turn away. And in John 9, we have this instance of the light of the world. Jesus uses that phrase of himself in verses 4 and 5. The light that has come into the world that shines, and yet people do not receive him. The context that we have of this passage, begins in John chapter 7, where the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths was going on, and the last ceremony, the celebration of this feast, was the lighting of large lanterns, which reminded the people of God's presence with them in the wilderness. And Jesus in John 8:12 had already said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me and believes in me, he'll have life. And that life is that light which enlightens all men." But unfortunately, what we find here is that the one who gives light, the one who is light, well, he brings light to the world. There is more than just physical light that is needed. We'll notice that this man who is born blind receives sight not just in one way, but in two. But there's a little bit of a delay in the two instances of him seeing more clearly. What is it then about this light that helps us to understand how, as Christians who are witnesses for Jesus Christ, how we are to be those witnesses? We need to answer a few questions that this passage raises, and it helps us then to think rightly, humbly, gently, and appropriately in being Christ's witnesses. And the first thing I want us to really wrestle with is this question as to why people are spiritually blind. Why is it? We are told in verse 1 that as Jesus, he leaves the temple. This is the insinuation of verse 1. He's leaving the temple. He's declared that he is the light of the world. And as he leaves the temple, he goes out, and do you notice how verse 1 says it? It says it in such a provocative way. And he saw a man blind from birth. The one who sees here is the one who has the eyesight to notice the one who cannot see. The one who sees all things and knows all things is the one who notices the man who cannot see. And as he sees this man, he sees that there is a real issue here. The reason that this man is blind, we will discover, is a debated topic. The disciples notice, it seems, that Jesus is paying attention to this man. And because he's paying attention to this man, they ask the question. It's a question that revolves in the universe, in the hearts of many people. Jesus, Rabbi, teacher, this man's blind. Why is he blind? Did he sin, or did his parents sin? The assumption of the universe, of the human heart, is that there is something called karma. It's not something that Christians have embraced, because it is this notion that what goes around comes around, that what you give is what you get, that what happens to you is deserved to you. And so this debate had arisen in first century Judaism about the nature of who was at fault. If someone was physically unwell, was there a reason that they were unwell? Was it their fault, or was it their parents' fault? Had there been some sort of sin that that had caused this problem? This world of living in karma means that you get what you deserve, what's coming to you. That you ought to get what you deserve, and you ought to expect that you're going to get what you deserve. Now, everybody wants justice. We call this also justice. We want justice for everyone else, but when it comes to us, we're hoping that we don't get what we deserve. Because if we got what we deserve, we know that it would not pay off well for us. We don't want that for ourselves. What we want is we want something different than what the other person gets. And so, as the disciples asked the question, Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? The answer comes from Jesus in verse 3. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. We have to understand why people are the way they are in order to be effective witnesses to those people. If we only think that people get what they deserve, the posture that we will take towards people is one of standing a little bit above them and thinking that we are a whole lot better than them. That we think that they get what they deserve, and that somehow we're on a different plane or a different category because we haven't done the bad things that they have done. We live in a world where all evil is the result of sin. All evil is a result of sin. And yet we have to make some very, very fine distinctions here so that we remain in a posture of humility and not a posture of arrogance. And here's where the fine distinctions come. All evil, all suffering is a result of sin, but not all evil is a result of personal moral choices. There are some decisions that we make that have absolute, logical, natural consequences. When you are being reckless and careless and someone says to you, don't touch the oven, it's hot, and you put your hand on the oven, you get what you deserve. That's a natural consequence. However, not every situation of evil is a result of natural consequences. There are things that happen to us, and we can take care of our bodies, we can eat the best foods, we can stay physically active, we can take care of ourselves in all kinds of ways, and yet you can still end up with cancer. And that's not because you did something to deserve it. And we need to make that very clear, because there is often this sense of, what did I do to deserve this? Or, even worse than what did I do to deserve this, is what did that person do to deserve it? And it can create this posture that is so dangerous, that I can stand a little bit above you and a little bit above, and I can look down upon you. The distinction that we have to make is that while there are natural consequences for actions that we do make, there is also a Genesis 3 sin-cursed world. that we live in a world that is tainted by sin. Since our very first parents who disobeyed, the result is going to be that there is suffering and brokenness and hurt. The best people will get cancer, and they will suffer. And the worst people can live a long and healthy and good life. And it is not because of karma. The reality is that because we live in this world, the rain falls, as Jesus can say, on the just and the unjust. God puts rain on the garden of the person who is wicked and on the person who is good. It's his kindness, it's his mercy. And so Jesus makes it abundantly clear that he has compassion upon this man, not because of someone's choices or decision, but rather it is so that the works of God might be on display. And so Jesus, in seeing the man and recognizing that he cannot see, does what only Jesus can do. He spits in the ground, he makes some mud, he takes the mud and he puts it on the man's eyes as a salve and tells him to go and wash in the pool called Sent, Siloam. And so we are told that having said these things and done the miracle, the man, in verse 7, went, washed, and came back seeing. This was the great miracle that Jesus had done. It was a sign. The reason that people are spiritually blind is the same reason people are physically blind. It could be that they have done something as a natural consequence that causes them to have an inability to see. But the reality is that all people are born in a state of sin and misery. We're born into a Genesis 3 world. This world is cursed. And so this is why Jesus can have compassion upon people. We are not only perpetrators of sin, but we are also victims of sin. From the very moment we are born, we're inflicted with sin, the sin of this world, which prevents us from seeing clearly. But it leads then to this second question that we have to wrestle through with, which is, how do people respond? When we look at Jesus, this light of the world, we recognize there are three ways in this passage that people respond to Jesus as the light of the world. There is unbelief, there is indecision or being undecided, and there is a response of faith or belief. So let's look at each of these in turn. First is a response of unbelief. As the people find this man and suddenly he sees, they respond, these neighbors, they've known this man for a long time and there's confusion. Is this the guy? Yes, I think it's the guy. Well, he looks like him, but I'm not sure that this is the guy. And a debate kind of goes on. It's kind of a crazy debate. This story is filled with, I heard someone laughing as I was reading this. There's so much humor in this story because it's ridiculous. He looks the same, but he sees. I don't think it's the same guy. Well, I think it is the same guy. Do you think it's the same guy? You can almost hear Laurel and Hardy developing a sketch here, can't you? Like there's this who's on first, what's on second kind of routine going on. And as they talk about this man, they bring him to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees say, well, tell us about what happened. And he tells the story of, in verses 13 through 16, how he was healed and how he received sight. And the Pharisees have this immediate alarm go off. Wah, wah, wah. Sabbath breaker, this cannot be a legitimate miracle. Jesus spit in the ground, and when he spit on the ground, he had to mix the dirt into mud and then picked it up and put it on his eyes. And that is a direct violation of the fourth commandment, which says, on the Sabbath day, you shall do no work. So this can't be a legitimate work of God. There's no way. Our man-made traditions and rules specify that you can't do this. You cannot work on the Sabbath. And how could a miracle ever come by working on the Sabbath when you're breaking the Sabbath? This already was a debate that they had had back in chapter 7. And in chapter 7, verse 20, Jesus had already addressed the issue. He had said, listen, the definitions that you have about work on the Sabbath are so skewed, and I have come to do the works of my Father. But in chapter 7, verse 20 to 24, the Pharisees hadn't accepted this argument. They'd already lost the argument, and yet they persist in saying, no, we're right. We're right in what is going on. But the crowd who is around sees the flawed logic. Because as the Pharisees begin to speculate, they're saying, this man broke the commandment. The commandment means that he must not be from God. He is a sinner. And so the crowd responds by saying, how could a sinner do this? How, the logic, it just doesn't flow. How could a sinner do a miraculous work of God? So the Pharisees then call the parents in verses 18 to 23, and they go, is this your son? Was he blind? We need to establish some facts. And we find the parents are a little bit hesitant here, and we'll come back to them, but they're told, it's our son, but he's of age. Go talk to him. Like, you can almost hear the comedy here again. Yeah, he was blind, but talk to him about whether or not he can see. And so they turn back to the man then in verse 24, and they say, tell us again. And so the man reiterates the facts. That's exactly what he does. They say, give glory to God. In other words, they pull out the biggest, fattest, blackest Bible that they can say, and they tell him, put your right hand on the Bible, and with your other hand, raise it in the air and say, do you swear to tell the whole truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God? This is an inquisition that's going on now. Tell us the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And the man responds with, well, it becomes so comical. It becomes comical, and we chuckle at it because of how ridiculous it is. The religious leaders ask for more than just the facts. He responds with the facts. I was blind. A man made mud. He put it on my eyes, told me to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. I did that, and now I see. And the Pharisees dispute this over and over. Facts don't matter. Truth doesn't matter. Evidence doesn't matter. What matters is Jesus broke the Sabbath, and how could a sinner ever do a miracle of God? But the man sees that this logic is so skewed, which is why, as he responds to them in verse 30, he answers them in terms of where Jesus comes from with this astonishment. They've already questioned Jesus in chapter 7 as to where he comes from. They know where he comes from. But the man responds, now that he sees, he says in verse 30, why, this is an amazing thing. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. This is an amazing thing. And in fact, the man goes as far to say is, you kind of keep coming back to me with question after question. Do you want to follow Jesus too? I have to assume that you're obsessed with this because you want to follow him. We chuckle because the man sees that these Pharisees, who should know better, are acting in total ignorance. And yet the response of the Pharisees is that when it says in verse 34 that they kicked him out, it is an act of excommunication. They are removing him from the fellowship of the synagogue. Anyone, we are told back in verses 20 to 23, who had identified with Jesus that he was the Messiah, was going to be excommunicated. Here's the problem with unbelief. Unbelief is a response for some people because they refuse to accept evidence and facts and truth, and they can hear testimony after testimony, but because their heart is hard and they have already determined how they are going to respond, they shut down. They will not believe. It doesn't matter what you tell them. And some people are just like this. You can tell them fact after fact, and they still go, that's your truth. Right? That's your truth. There's a total dismissal. And that dismissal comes from a proud and arrogant heart that thinks it knows better. But there's a second response here, which is the response of the undecided. The undecided are in verses 20 to 23. It's the parents. As the parents are called, they're asked for the evidence. Is this your son? Was he born blind? Tell us the facts. And the parents respond in these verses out of concern. The parents answer in verse 20, "We know that this is our son, that he was born blind, but how he sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age." The undecided here is this position of, I want to remain morally neutral. There are various reasons why people want to remain morally neutral. And in this passage, what we're told is that the reason they wanted to remain morally neutral is one simple fact. They were afraid. They were afraid of what would happen to them if they said, "This is our son, and he sees," and it was Jesus. They want to hand off the responsibility to their son. They want to remain morally neutral. They want to insist that they don't have to make a decision. They want to be the undecided in the poll. And they always want to be undecided because they want to keep their options open. But in being undecided, what they show is that there is no neutral ground. There are only two positions when it comes to responding to Jesus: unbelief or belief. There is no moral neutrality when it comes to Jesus. There is no position of neutrality. There is no sitting on the fence. Either we follow Jesus or we don't. It's that simple. It's a binary response. Yes or no. Jesus says, "I am the light of the world," and there is no middle option. There is no light and middle ground and then darkness. There is either light or there is darkness. The darkness is dispelled by the light. And the light comes and it calls for a response. And so there is this posture of unbelief by the religious leaders. The unbelief that we find here by the parents are actually a posture of trying to be undecided. But then there is the posture of belief. Now you notice that when this man is healed, something amazing happens. He sees, but when he is asked about who Jesus is and who did this, the story develops. Beginning at verse 11, all the way down to the end when he encounters Jesus in verse 34 or 35, there is this development of the story. There is this progression. This man starts off when he is asked how he became able to see. He responds by saying in verse 11, "The man called Jesus did this." And at first all he can say is, it was Jesus. It was a man. It was just a man. But by the time that he's pressed for more facts in verses 13 to 16, and he's asked for a response in verse 17, he's more than a man. Jesus is more than a man. Do you see that in verse 17? Who is Jesus? He's the prophet. He's a man who must know something from God. But this agitates the Pharisees, and they press him for more detail, and they want more detail, and they're really trying to hone in with accuracy on what's going on. And so by the time that this man starts to make confessions of who Jesus is, and they kick him out of the synagogue, in verses 30 to 33, the man is already now responding more strongly than it's just a man, it's a prophet. Now he's saying, this has got to be someone sent from God. It's got to be someone from God because no one has ever opened the eyes of the blind. And there is this progression that moves from a man to a prophet to someone sent from God to then Jesus showing up in verse 35, and he says to the man these words, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." And he said, "Lord, I believe," and worshipped him. There is a delay in the miracle of the physical seeing and the spiritual seeing. And in this sign that John gives, another one of the signs of his gospel of what it looks like to believe, he makes it abundantly clear that it is Jesus who seeks out the man in order that belief might happen. Do you see that in verse 35? It's not the man going to look for Jesus. He's never seen Jesus. When Jesus performed the miracle, put the mud on his eyes, he sent him away to the pool of Siloam. And by the time that he washed his eyes, Jesus wasn't around. And when he came back, he has this argument with the Pharisees and the neighbors and the crowds. But it's in verse 35 that Jesus is the one who seeks out him. Jesus seeks out him and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? This Old Testament reference to the Messiah who would come and bring deliverance and rescuer of the world, who would do, as Luke read this morning from Isaiah 35, he would bring sight to the blind and the lame would leap and there would be joy in the heart of those who were discouraged. This is the one, the Messiah who would come. He's the one who has come, and it's he who seeks out the man who has received the miracle. Jesus, in other words, does the work of seeking and saving the lost. And by seeking and saving out the lost, Jesus shows the man. He reveals to the man who he is. And this is how people are always saved. Always. It is Jesus who seeks out the sinner and reveals himself to them. He shows them his glory, his greatness, and his power. Helen Keller was a girl who lost her eyesight at a young age, and she became not only blind but deaf. Over the years, she became an unruly girl because she had become so accustomed to the darkness and the silence of her world that people could barely manage her. But along had come someone who had developed a plan of an approach to help Helen be able to communicate by putting sign language and tapping the signs into her hand so that she could have a way of hearing. Helen Keller would later respond after this great miracle of being able to communicate again by saying, gradually I got used to the silence and darkness that surrounded me, and I forgot that it had ever been different until she came, my teacher, who set my spirit free. And this is what Jesus does. He comes to people who are blind and deaf, who have gotten so used to being blind and deaf, that as the teacher, the rabbi, he comes and he opens the eyes of the blind. And he does this in such a way that people can see. John Newton, a pastor, was not originally a pastor when he started out in the 17th century in England. His father was the owner of ships, and he would use those ships to go get slaves from Africa to sell them. Newton had seen the crassness, the harshness of his father, and had begun to emulate the character of his father. On one occasion when they were on the seas and they came across a storm, Newton's life was put at risk, and he cried out to God for mercy. His mother, who was a Christian, had been praying for young John for all these years. And through this encounter, it led John Newton to profess faith in Jesus Christ, abandon the slave trade, and not only abandon it, but oppose it. And in opposing it, he also came to write one of the greatest, most loved hymns that people know today. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. 'Twas blind, but now I see. Jesus responds to this man in having compassion on him in verses 1 and 2, and doing a miracle in verses 6 and following. But by the end of this story, Jesus has compassion on him in verses 35 and following, to not only heal his physical eyes, but to do a greater miracle, to give him spiritual sight, to open the eyes of his heart, which Paul says in Ephesians 1, that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, that you may behold the beauty, the richness, the glory, the majesty, the power, the splendor, the authority of Jesus Christ, and that by knowing him, having the eyes of your heart enlightened, that you may live to his praise and to his glory. So if Jesus does this great miracle of opening the eyes of the blind, if people respond either in unbelief, in indecision, or in belief, then what's our responsibility? What's our responsibility then when we come across various types of people? Now we've got a little bit of tools. We've got some tools to do a little bit of diagnostics. We can see if someone's spiritually hard-hearted or if they're open. But what is our responsibility? We have to see that Jesus is the one who can open the eyes of the heart, and we can't. You and I can never cause someone to see clearly. Never. We can speak persuasively, we can speak gently, we can speak lovingly, but it has to be a miraculous work of Jesus coming and revealing himself to the person. If the Pharisees, in verse 31, who think that they are able to see but are really blind, are in the state of unbelief, then we have to recognize that there is a certain amount of spiritual pride that is so dangerous. Spiritual pride can cause us to have arrogance, which thinks that we're a little bit better than other people and that we stand above them. And if we stand above them, then we don't have a posture of compassion like Jesus, but what we have is a posture of condemnation and of arrogance. And it is in this spiritual pride which leads to arrogance that causes people to be blind. They don't see clearly. And this is why the Pharisees used their power to excommunicate the man. They kick him out of the synagogue. They wanted nothing to do with him. Because Jesus is a lawbreaker, and anybody who associates with a lawbreaker has to be excommunicated. But notice that it is Jesus again who comes to this man. And this is the pattern of how Jesus works. It is always the one of approach. It is Jesus who comes near. It is Jesus who makes the initial move. It is Jesus who acts with compassion. And when Jesus comes to this man, and it's not the man coming to Jesus, he doesn't wait for him to see and to understand before he sends them. We're told as he does the miracle, he sends him to the pool of Siloam, which is called sent. And in the same way, Jesus sends us. He tells us in verse 4, we have to work for the night is coming. And tonight, that night is coming where there is darkness. There is a real heaven and there is a real hell. There is an eternity that is at stake with people. And we ought to have compassion upon them. That hell ought not to be something that we use with bravado and that we use with harshness. It ought to bring tears to our eyes. That people would spend an eternity separated from God. And not only separated from God, but in eternal conscious torment. For being rebels who steal glory from God. That ought to break our hearts. And it means that we ought to work since the night is coming, Jesus says. But as long as the light of the world is in the world, the message of the light can be sent. There was a man who looked as hard as any Pharisee, and his name was Saul. Saul was a man who wanted to keep the integrity of the Jewish religion pure. He had done everything possible to keep the faith. He kept the law, and he considered it his responsibility to enact the curses of Deuteronomy by stoning anyone, killing them with stones if they broke the law, if they believed in Jesus. And so he had made it his mission to keep Judaism pure. He was, as far as Pharisees go, he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. With regard to the law, he was blameless. But one day on the Damascus Road, as he was heading towards another Christian group that was meeting, he was struck blind by a light that shone from heaven. And a voice spoke from the light and said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" We think that Saul was so hardened, that he was immovable, that he was a Pharisee with a rock-solid heart that could never be budged. And yet in that moment, when the light of the glory of Christ struck him, he was blinded, and then he came to see as the scales fell off his eyes, and he was able to see more clearly than he ever had been before. This is why this same Saul could write these words in 2 Corinthians 4. He could say in 2 Corinthians 4:4, in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. The reason people don't see is that there is a real devil who loves to blind people from seeing the truth. And Saul was one of those people. And he could write these words saying, I was once blind. For what we proclaim, he goes on to say in verse 5, what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone into our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. This was his experience on the Damascus Road. This is how he came to see. It was God interrupting him. And he would spend the rest of his life working because he knew the night was coming. He knew that there was a night coming, which is why he would go on to write in 2 Corinthians 6 these words, working together with him, with God then, we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in a favorable time I listened to you, and in a day of salvation I helped you. Behold, when is the day of salvation? Behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. We ought to ask people a simple question. Won't you receive the light of Christ? We ought to ask them for a decision. What stops us? Work, for the night is coming. An eternity is at stake. And this man who has turned water into wine, he's brought sight to the blind. He shows us that there is no one like him. Not since the beginning of the world has anyone opened the eyes of the blind. And by his grace, he has opened my eyes so that I might share of this good news, and he has opened your eyes so that you might share as well.